For centuries, humans have been drawn to explore these underground labyrinths, driven by curiosity and the thrill of discovery. I think it's a stupid hobby that gets too many people into trouble. The risk is not worth it. Venturing into caves comes with inherent dangers that can transform adventure into tragedy in mere moments. The Sterkfontein Cave Incident. On September 29, 1984, cave explorer Nuno Gomes and his two friends, Peter Verheul and Malcolm, planned to explore and map unmapped sections of the Sterkfontein Cave in South Africa. Their objective was straightforward: lay a guideline from the entrance to the farthest point of the wet cave area, known as Milner Hall. The plan called for Nuno to enter the water and place the guideline while Peter and Malcolm provided assistance from the surface. Nuno successfully completed his mission, laying a line covering 396 feet from the entrance to the deepest point. Elated by their success, the three friends decided to dive in together, following the newly placed guideline to the air pocket at the end. After reaching their destination, they turned around and began their journey back, following the line with Nuno leading the way. Suddenly, Nuno felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Malcolm, signaling that Peter was no longer behind them. Concerned, Nuno backtracked to find Peter, eventually locating him in a side tunnel. He tapped Peter to get his attention and signaled him to return to the guideline and exit the cave. As they headed back, however, Peter disappeared once again. This time, Nuno and Malcolm assumed he had taken another exit to avoid a tight squeeze, so they continued without searching for him. Upon surfacing, the realization struck them like a physical blow. Peter was nowhere to be found. After waiting anxiously for his emergence, they submerged once more to conduct a search. For 4 exhausting hours, they combed the guideline and side tunnels, but found no trace of Peter. Eventually, they ran out of air tanks, and the stirred-up silt reduced visibility to near zero, forcing them to exit the cave and call for help. The fire brigade arrived quickly but lacked cave diving expertise, so they had to wait for police divers to continue the search. By evening, visibility was severely compromised by the disturbed silt. The police, convinced they were now searching for a body rather than a survivor, called off the search for the night. What no one realized was that Peter was very much alive. He had become disoriented in a secondary tunnel, and the cave's complex three-dimensional structure, combined with the lack of a guideline, the stirred-up silt, and the complete darkness, made it nearly impossible for him to find his way back. After attempting various possible paths, Peter found a small room and decided to wait there for rescuers. He shone his light into the water, hoping to signal his friends. But when no one came for hours, he switched it off to conserve his dwindling battery. He tried making noise by banging his tank against the rocks, but his efforts went unheard. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell asleep, losing track of time. The police closed off the cave after that first night, preventing further entry. Unfortunately, the silt took days to settle, severely hampering visibility. Convinced Peter had not survived, they decided to wait a full week before resuming the search. On October 6th, 7 days after Peter's disappearance, they returned but found no sign of him. Another week passed before their next attempt, which also yielded nothing. Meanwhile, Peter remained alive in the darkness. He had spent 14 days in complete darkness, slowly starving and losing significant weight. Desperate for an exit, he followed a passage leading from his small sanctuary. After traveling 120 feet away from the water, he discovered it was only a dead end, so he returned to his spot near the water to wait once more for rescuers who never came. For 6 weeks, the police conducted weekend searches but found nothing. Finally, they called off the operation and reopened the dry sections of the cave while keeping the water section closed. Volunteers then began searching for a connection between the dry and wet cave systems, with Nuno joining their efforts. His contributions proved crucial. He discovered the connection that allowed them to enter the wet section of the cave. It was there that they found footprints leading to a dead end, and soon after, Peter's body. Beside him lay a heartbreaking message: "I love you, Churl and Ma." Later investigations revealed that one search party had come within 100 feet of Peter's location. The autopsy revealed he had died of starvation after 3 weeks in the cave. Although we might question Peter's decision to explore on his own, we must also acknowledge his extraordinary will to survive until the very end. The Crooked Swamp Incident. On March 27, 1982, Donald Wellner and his 2 sons, Christopher and Roger, prepared to lead 12 Boy Scouts on a day of cave exploration. This wasn't Donald's first caving experience, and despite the notoriously narrow passages in the Crooked Swamp cave system, he felt confident. Donald was larger than the other participants, so his reasoning was simple. If he could navigate the tight spaces, the rest of the group would have no trouble. At 2 p.m., the group entered the cave through its narrow 16 by 28-inch entrance and stopped in a room inside. Donald, positioned on the eastern side, observed several smaller tunnels branching from the main chamber. Uncertain which passages might be too narrow for safe passage, he decided to check one personally. The tunnel required a tight squeeze but appeared to open into another section, so he pushed forward. The squeeze measured just 18 by 20 inches. So constricted that he couldn't move his arms backward or lift his head to see what lay ahead. His sons followed behind as he moved forward, helped by the slippery mud that lined the passage. He maintained verbal communication with them, reporting his progress. Everything seemed normal until a sudden, unexpected development occurred. As Donald pulled himself along, he realized with growing horror that the ground beneath him was disappearing. He slipped down into a tight crevice, the slick mud preventing him from halting his slide. His hands became trapped in the narrow space, leaving him with no leverage to pull himself up. The situation worsened as the path angled downward at approximately 30 degrees, forcing him to fight against gravity. The crevice was a mere 5 inches wide, and the slippery mud caused his body to settle deeper with each passing moment. Donald instructed his sons to pull on his feet, but after several failed attempts, he directed them to find Jim, the other adult in the cave. After assessing the situation, Jim also realized they wouldn't be able to free Donald without additional help. Donald explained that some rocks had loosened during his slide and were now wedging against his body. Each time they attempted to pull him backward, the loose rocks would slide forward, further blocking the passage. Jim exited the cave to call for help. Soon, cave rescue specialists and police arrived at the scene. Due to the extremely narrow space that allowed only one person to squeeze through at a time, they attempted to use ropes to free Donald. When this proved ineffective, they brought in tools to break some of the rocks. However, given the confined space, hours of work yielded only minimal progress while Donald's condition steadily deteriorated. He was thirsty, hungry, and trapped in a very cold environment, making hypothermia a significant concern. The rescue team considered entering from another direction to provide Donald with food and water, but discovered that the passage leading to his position was extremely narrow. Only two very small cavers, sisters Lynn and Nancy Taylor, were able to fit through the space, but even they couldn't reach Donald's head. This meant there was no way to deliver vital supplies, forcing rescuers to act with increasing urgency. They decided to dig from above ground, directly down to Donald's location. The excavation continued throughout Sunday, bringing them close to the required depth. Unfortunately, they were still about 12 feet away from Donald's position horizontally, necessitating lateral digging. Meanwhile, Donald's responses had deteriorated to mere grunts, indicating he was likely suffering from severe hypothermia. By Monday morning, 2 days after Donald became trapped, the digging continued. But the team encountered an insurmountable obstacle, layers of extremely hard bedrock that were impossible to penetrate with their tools. At this point, they weren't certain if Donald was still alive, so they sent a nurse into the cave with a handheld Doppler machine to check for a pulse. She couldn't detect one, but this wasn't definitive proof of death since she only had access to his very cold legs, and sometimes the body's core organs can continue functioning after extremities have stopped registering vital signs. Seeing how rapidly Donald's condition had deteriorated, rescuers resorted to their most extreme measures, including dynamite, an incredibly risky approach, but seemingly the only remaining option. On Tuesday morning, they finally managed to reach his location, and a doctor was immediately sent in. As many had feared, Donald had already died. It took an entire day to retrieve his body, and an autopsy later confirmed he had succumbed to hypothermia sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning. Following his death, the cave system was restricted to limited access only. The Aegean Allwed incident. Roger Solari and Martin Farr, 26 and 23 years old respectively, shared an ambitious goal to map out the Aegean Allwed cave system in South Wales. At the time, another explorer named John Parker had abandoned the mission after discovering a third sump in one of the cave's longest passages. Martin and Roger, however, were determined to continue and discover what lay beyond. The first exploration was undertaken by Martin alone because Roger had injured his knee, making it extremely dangerous for Martin to proceed solo. Reaching the third sump was an achievement in itself, as the route was not only tortuous but also extremely long, requiring hours of travel, since the first sump was located about a mile into the cave. The first two sumps measured only 249 feet and 82 feet, allowing Martin to pass through them relatively easily. However, the third sump was much longer, and no one had fully explored it yet, leaving Martin to hope he had sufficient air to reach the end. Fortunately, he managed to swim through the approximately 850-foot sump, and on the other side, he discovered something intriguing, a zigzagging passage roughly 1,800 feet long, leading to yet another sump that no one had previously documented. Martin realized he probably wouldn't have enough air to explore this fourth sump, and then return safely, so he spent the next 4 to 5 hours heading back out, planning to wait for Roger so they could tackle the fourth sump together on their next expedition. When they returned on June 15, 1974, both Roger and Martin brought extra air tanks. They successfully reached the fourth sump and began diving it, laying down a guideline to help map the route. After about 400 feet, Roger finished his guideline, and despite experiencing sinus problems, not for the first time, they decided to continue. Martin then deployed his own guideline, and they pressed on. They made a critical error in judgment. In cave diving, there's a fundamental safety principle known as the rule of thirds for air consumption. If you use 1/3 of your air supply on the way in, you need another third to get out, leaving the final third as an emergency reserve. They had already consumed their first third and should have turned back when Roger's line ran out, especially since Roger's tank was smaller than Martin's. Martin assumed Roger would head out while he continued forward. He eventually reached a gravel wall of rock, which could have indicated the sump was ending and possibly led to an air pocket. By this point, he was well past the halfway mark of his tank, making the situation extremely risky. Nevertheless, he pushed on until he encountered solid rock, confirming there was no air pocket in that direction. Spotting a passage to the right, he explored another 29 feet, but it ended in a dead end. When Martin backtracked, he was shocked to find Roger still there. Martin quickly signaled that they needed to return immediately. Roger, likely realizing he didn't have enough air to make it back, attempted to locate the same air pocket Martin had been searching for. Martin continued about 130 feet until his main tank ran out, forcing him to switch to a reserve tank that would give him only about 300 feet in Sump 4 and another 850 feet in Sump 3, barely enough to return. However, he had previously placed a partially filled tank between Sump 3 and Sump 2, which he hoped to reach. Finally emerging from Sump 4, Martin sat on the bank waiting for Roger, who, remember, had a smaller tank. If Roger didn't appear soon, it would become a serious problem. After 20 minutes with no sign of his partner, Martin realized that even if Roger surfaced from Sump 4 at that moment, he likely wouldn't have enough air left to get through Sump 3. After an hour, Martin was certain Roger's air had run out. He entered the water again and tried pulling the guideline to make it taut, but discovered it was no longer connected. It had been cut at approximately the 430-foot mark. This was probably where Roger needed to change tanks. Because switching tanks wasn't a simple task at the time, he might have put his arm through the line to avoid losing it, twisted his body to reach the valve, and become tangled, forcing him to cut the line to move freely. This, combined with the silt kicked up by movement, likely reduced his visibility, causing him to swim in the wrong direction. At that point, there was no doubt that Roger had exhausted his air supply. Martin remained calm and managed to navigate the next 3 sumps safely. He immediately alerted authorities, and the search for Roger's body began. Martin himself joined the search along with many others. However, Roger's remains weren't discovered until 1986, 12 years later. Recovering the body was deemed too risky, so it was left in the cave, and a plaque was placed near the entrance of Sump 1 in Roger's honor. In 1987, another explorer passed through Sump 4 and finally located the air pocket 875 feet in, the very one Roger and Martin had hoped to find. It was named the Against All Odds Chamber. Martin stated that after this incident, he never again broke the rule of thirds. He went on to have a remarkable diving career. Today, the entrance to the cave system is locked, and only specific experienced divers are granted a key. The Floyd Collins Incident. In late December 1924, Floyd Collins discovered a cave he called Sand Cave, which was easily accessible to tourists due to its proximity to a highway. He quickly struck a deal with the land's owners to receive 50% of any profits from the cave's exploration and immediately began working there. Since there was no significant entrance, many tourists avoided the cave. As a result, Floyd spent hours every day over the next few weeks digging deeper and deeper. On January 30th, 1925, despite the snowy conditions outside, Floyd ventured into the cave once again, only to make a shocking discovery. Crawling forward with a lantern, he reached what was known as the turnaround room, so named because many cavers would stop there and turn back, deeming it too risky to continue. The only way to proceed further was through a tiny narrow hole called the Squeeze, which measured only 9 inches in height. Floyd, however, managed to push through. Beyond the Squeeze, he encountered a narrow pit dropping about 10 feet. He descended feet first and reached the bottom, where he found yet another pit. Squatting down, he removed the remaining rocks and debris and finally saw an opening into the main cave. He tied a rope in place and descended an 80-foot drop, reaching the cavern floor. He was amazed by the sight, but noticed his light was starting to dim. Wanting to avoid being left in complete darkness, he climbed back up the 80-foot drop and began his return journey, moving backward and pushing his lantern with his shoulder. Unfortunately, his lantern slipped into a tiny hole and shattered, plunging him into total darkness. Because the cavern was extremely unstable, Floyd knew he had to move carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks. Unable to see, however, he accidentally kicked one loose, and it fell onto his left leg, trapping him. He tried freeing himself with his right leg, but the more he moved, the more rocks tumbled down, further wedging him in place. It was 10 a.m. when his ordeal began, and he started shouting for help, hoping someone would hear him. He remained there all day, and by 9 a.m. the next morning, nearly 24 hours after becoming trapped, 2 of the cave's owners arrived with their 17-year-old son, Jewel Estes, to check on him. They spotted Floyd's coat hanging outside the cave and called his name, but received no answer. Venturing deeper, the 2 owners soon turned back because the passages were too tight. But Jewel continued and eventually found Floyd, who asked him to call his brothers for help. Soon, Marshall Collins, Floyd's brother, and Lee Collins, Floyd's father, reached the entrance, finding a growing crowd watching the rescue attempt. Marshall and another man went inside to widen the passage, digging carefully to avoid sending loose rocks tumbling onto Floyd. At 4 p.m., Floyd's other brother, Homer, arrived. Floyd had previously asked Homer to accompany him that day, so Homer felt guilty for refusing and did his best to help. He did reach Floyd, but a new problem emerged. The crowds outside had started multiple bonfires, and the melting ice funneled freezing cold water into the cave, creating mud and directing a chilling stream toward Floyd. After 8 exhausting hours with Floyd, his brothers needed rest. Upon emerging, Homer grew furious at the huge crowd that had gathered, telling people to leave if they couldn't help. However, no one heeded his words. Reporters began arriving, hoping to interview Homer. Tired of their questions, he told them to see for themselves inside the cave. Confusion and rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed Floyd was already dead, or that the cave had collapsed entirely. Determined to prove otherwise, Marshall offered a $500,000 reward to anyone who saved his brother. As rumors intensified, he went to check on Floyd himself and found him alive. Floyd had managed to free one hand and suggested they tie a rope around his chest to pull him out. But as soon as they tried, he begged them to stop, saying he felt like he was being torn in two. Homer worked tirelessly, removing dirt and debris until he was completely exhausted and required medical attention. By Tuesday night, 95 hours after Floyd had become trapped, a reporter named SKS entered the cave and installed a light bulb near Floyd. While removing rubble, SKS exposed more of Floyd's legs, but still couldn't free him. His story and interview with Floyd were published, drawing even larger crowds. Hotels nearby were filled, and at least 1,000 people gathered around Sand Cave. All this activity further weakened the cave walls, putting it at risk of collapse, though nobody realized it at the time, as everyone was rooting for Floyd's rescue. At hour 1:23, disaster struck. The entrance to the pit collapsed, blocking any access to Floyd and cutting off deliveries of food and water. By hour 1:44, a team of workers formed to dig a new tunnel to reach him. The only way they could know if Floyd was still alive was through the light bulb SKS had installed, which was connected to another bulb outside that would flicker when Floyd breathed. They dug relentlessly, but with no food or water reaching Floyd. Combined with the cold temperature, his chances were fading quickly. By Friday, February 13th, the men had nearly reached him, and one worker reported hearing groaning about 10 feet away. However, at 1:30 a.m. on February 16th, a worker finally reached Floyd and found him deceased. Initially, Floyd's body was left in the cave, but after some time, his brother Homer arranged for its removal and gave him a proper burial. Which death do you think was the worst? I'll pick a random person who comments to go to a cave and tell us if they can survive 10 days under the ground.